Okay, good morning everyone. We're going to get started. First up, the usual health and safety announcement. There's no fire alarm drill anticipated today, so if the alarm sounds, please leave the building through the nearest fire exit by following the signs above the doors. Make your way to the rear of the car park and wait there until you are told it is safe to return. Please also make sure all phones are either muted or switched off. To start the meeting then, good morning everyone and welcome to this Strategic Planning Committee meeting on Tuesday the 5th of November 2024. I'm your Chair, Councillor Todd Olive. To my right is Vice Chair, Councillor Mike Howe. Supporting officers present are Ed Freeman, Assistant Director, Planning, Strategy and Development Management, Damien Hunter, Planning Solicitor, and Debbie Meakin, Democratic Services Officer. Can I remind everyone present that this meeting is audio recorded for subsequent publication on the Council's website, so please can members and officers making a contribution to the meeting use a microphone or your comments will not be recorded. We will now start the meeting by doing a roll call of committee members.
Thank you, Chair. I'll start with yourself and members. Can you please let me know if you have any declarations as I go through the roll call? Chair, morning.
Thank you. I am here and I have no declarations.
Thank you very much. Moving on to our Vice Chair, Councillor Howe.
I am unfortunately here and at this time, no declarations that I know of.
Thank you very much. Next to Councillor Brian Bailey. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm here with no declarations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Moving next to Jessica Bailey. Good morning.
Good morning. Present. No declarations. But I may have to. I'm not sure what time the meeting's going to go on till, but I may have to leave before the end of it. Thank you.
Thanks for letting us know. Moving on to Councillor Colin Brown. Good morning, Colin.
Good morning. Present, no declarations.
Thank you very much. Next to Councillor Bethany Collins. Good morning, Bethany.
Good morning. I'm present and nothing to declare.
On to Councillor Ollie Davey. Good morning.
Good morning. No declarations and I'm here.
Thank you very much. Next to Councillor Ben Ingham. Good morning, Ben.
Good morning. I'm present and nothing to declare.
Thank you. Moving on to Councillor Jeff Young. Morning, Jeff.
Good morning. I'm here and nothing to declare at the moment.
Thank you very much. And last but by no means least, Councillor Helen Parr. Good morning, Helen.
Morning. I'm here and nothing to declare.
And then very rudely, I forgot, Councillor Levine. Good morning, Yehudi.
I'm here despite the fact that you didn't call my name.
Thank you. My apologies. We are quorate, I can confirm, Chair. Thank you.
Do non-committee members have any declarations to make? No. Okay, thank you. We move on then to agenda item 1, minutes of the previous meeting held on the 23rd of October 2024. Unless anyone has anything to raise on these? No, okay, so I'll propose from the chair then that these are agreed as an accurate record of the meeting. All those in favour, please. That's unanimous, I think. Okay, I will sign those then. Agenda item 2, apologies.
I've had apologies from Councillor Paula Fernley, Chair. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Agenda item 3, declarations of interest, we have already done, which brings us then to agenda item 4, public speaking. We have 3 members of the public registered to speak, and first up we have a statement from Clem Davies on behalf of Lympstone Water Quality Group.
Thank you, Chair. So this is a statement from Clem Davies from the Lympstone Water Quality Group, who states, "Thank you for the opportunity to comment on Chapter 7. I'm a member of the Lympstone Water Quality Group, which is coordinating a catchment-based project to assess, protect and improve the water quality in the Wootton Brook and adjacent estuary." Hope I've pronounced that right. Maybe Watton Brook, apologies. I've had a career in water resources management. I support the vision in the draft local plan for a greener East Devon, which prioritises issues arising from climate change. However, I believe that it will be impossible to achieve this vision without a clear strategy for climate resilience, which embeds water quality into all stages of the planning process, along with flood risk and biodiversity. The lack of any real attention to water quality throughout the local plan, including Chapter 7, is concerning, considering the following. 1. The fundamental importance of water quality to biodiversity, human health, and the local economy. 2. The widely reported range of pollutants in our natural watercourses from sewerage systems, agriculture, roads, and urban developments. 3. The impact of climate change, increasing water surface runoff which carries pollutants and causes flooding. 4. Wide public concern. Neither the sustainability appraisal or the site selection methodology adequately addresses water quality issues, and the draft Habitats Regulations assessment has little clarity on this issue. Over the past 6 months, we have been reviewing planning applications for developments which could affect water quality, including a dairy farm and major housing schemes. We have found that there is no evidence that water quality risks are being identified, assessed, and managed by anyone in the planning process, including statutory consultees. Consequently, significant water quality risks and opportunities to minimise these risks are being missed. The development of an effective strategy on water quality needs careful review and wide consultation. Fundamentally, it needs to ensure that 1. The water quality is considered early in the planning process at the site selection, project concept and design stages. 2. Consideration is given to catchment-based risks and the capacity of the sewage system. 3. Every planning application is supported by a water quality risk assessment. 4. Risk management controls are incorporated into the design, for an example, an effective surface water treatment system to prevent pollution. 5. The controls are maintained in perpetuity. 6. The temporary surface water treatment system is developed before construction work commences to prevent pollution, for example, from sediment and oil. This is a great opportunity to achieve the local plan's vision, and I wish you success. And that's a statement, just to remind you, from Clem Davies from the Limestone Water Quality Group. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Debbie. Mr. Freeman, anything you want to add in response to that before we move on to the next public speakers? You can say no.
I think it's probably best to pick that up when we're looking at the relevant chapter later in the meeting.
Okay. In which case then we come to Dr. Karen Goman, a Hawkchurch resident.
Yes, I'm going to be talking about battery energy storage, which is mostly dealt with in Chapter 7, 7A and 7B. I was going to suggest that it would be a good idea to have a separate appendix dealing specifically with lithium-ion battery energy storage, because the points tend to be quite embedded in all the points about climate, the climate emergency and net zero. So the risk of thermal runaway leading to a fire and explosion in a lithium-ion battery energy storage system cannot be eliminated. Suppression systems cannot stop an exothermic reaction, and neither suppression systems nor deflagration panels work, according to many experts. Thermal runaway, fire and explosion will lead to a toxic plume and air, water and ground contamination. It must be recognised that bunding is not sufficient to contain the firewater required for cooling the surrounding containers. To take the NFCC, the Fire Chiefs Council, recommended rate of water to deal with the risk of reignition, that's 5 million litres. The Environment Agency should therefore be consulted for all BESS, that's battery energy storage systems applications, and more attention given to sensitive local environments with special attention on groundwater source areas, known as groundwater source protection zones, that exist to protect aquifers that supply drinking water, and that relates to the speech just given. BESS applications should address existing legislation on the hazardous substances that, in the event of a BESS fire, would likely exceed the threshold for emissions set by the Planning Act of 1990 on hazardous substances. And I got some points on specific parts of the strategy policy. So CC03 On point 2, could councillors note that no farming or biodiversity is possible on a BESS site? Point 3, on restoring the land, developers should provide, before validation of a BESS application, evidence of appropriate insurance that includes cover for loss of life and livelihoods in the 1 kilometre area surrounding a BESS. This is the radius referred to by the NFCC. Developers should also provide a bank-guaranteed letter of credit so that the council can be certain that all decommissioning costs will be met at the end of the BESS's 40-year life, and that the site will be restored to its original state as required under the terms of any approval. Further, any approval must contain the condition that any subsequent owner of the BESS, because these tend to be sold on, maintain the letter of credit, otherwise the licence will be terminated. The council needs to understand that each BESS is owned by a special purpose vehicle, partly in order to isolate the owner from future liability. This type of guarantee structure with a letter of credit is used in other licensed industries such as the offshore oil and gas sector in the North Sea. Otherwise, the decommissioning bond is not enforceable by the council, and the council will be left with the costs and the operation of compensation and cleaning up the area.
Could I ask you to come to a close, please, Dr. Gavin?
Sorry?
Could I ask you to come to a close, please? You've had your time. Thank you.
I'll just quickly say this. There's one point I want to quote: favoured locations have tended to be close to a suitable substation in order to provide grid services. This quoted point is not a policy statement, and the reason that developers target sites close to substations, especially those on rural land, is because it's cheaper for them. Cabling grid connection is cheaper, and leasing rural land is cheaper than nearer towns. And I was just going to add, the goals of net zero should be to protect the climate and the pasture that's been built on or proposed to be built on for BESS, that acts in itself as an important carbon sink. Policy should not encourage developers to industrialise rural environments with high carbon operations like BESS,
Please could you finish up, Dr. Gavin? We do need to get on with the meeting.
that will remove carbon sinks and in themselves create heat through charging and discharging. Thank you.
Thank you. And lastly, we have Mr. Mo Dobson.
Yes, I come as a delegate to make a statement from the Parish Council of Hawkchurch. Hawkchurch has considerable experience in recent years of planning applications for energy generation and storage and the impact of large-scale solar development. This has meant we have researched and kept abreast of developments in the industry. We would like to offer some suggestions for key points relating to the lithium-ion battery risks and more strategic amendments to the draft, specifically in relation to storage options. First of all, we welcome this draft, which is a much improved from the original. We welcome recognition of the fire safety aspects of lithium-ion batteries, and our first comments are some suggestions to enhance these based on our own experience. We think that in addition to the requirement for compliance with the NFCC guidance, there should be a clear indication that the Environment Agency must be properly engaged to agree proposals for containment in the event of an incident. At present, there is poor alignment in this area where one agency hands off responsibility to another. In the rural parts of East Devon, many residents rely on obtaining their water from groundwater sources such as wells or springs. We suggest that there should be a requirement for lithium-ion battery proposals that all source protection zones are mapped. Neither the Environment Agency nor DEFRA's MAGIC map show private water sources, but they are classed as SPZs. Developers generally rely on official mapping and so miss significant risks to private residents. We believe that ideally there should be some form of decommissioning guarantees, particularly where there is a risk of land or groundwater contamination. We know this is possible as it has been discussed in the past with one developer. More strategically, for the East Devon district to maximize the renewable energy being generated here, it is important to differentiate between the storage functions. There are basically three categories. A, storage next to where it is being generated. For example, battery storage connected behind the meter on a solar farm. This genuinely extends the use of local solar power. B, storage next to use. For example, high energy sites such as hospitals, industrial sites, etc. Storage in these locations can be used to maximize the use of renewable energy based on when it is stored during periods of maximum renewable energy generation. C, storage that simply connects into the grid. This type of storage may take energy from anywhere in the system and be used anywhere. We suggest that encouraging the first two types of storage, particularly if they use battery types that have extremely low environmental and safety risks, such as iron, salt flow batteries, would be strategically beneficial to the whole district. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Dobson. Mr. Freeman, I assume we can address those points when we get to Chapter 7A as the relevant chapter. Councillor Ingham, quickly.
Yeah, can I just check that the three speakers have sent their presentations to, the two here have passed on their presentations to Mr. Freeman? Have they done that? Have they emailed what you've just said to Mr. Freeman? To Mr. Freeman, yes. Thank you. Otherwise, what's the point of?
Well, in fairness, Mr. Freeman has just heard what they have to say as well. But we'll move on through the agenda, and thank you, folks, for coming along, sharing your thoughts. Agenda item 5, matters of urgency. There are none. And agenda item 6, to agree any items to be dealt with after the public have been excluded. Again, there are none. Which brings us then to agenda item 7, the East Devon Local Plan, redrafting of local plan chapters. Mr. Freeman.
Thank you, Chair. So this report continues previous discussions around redrafting of chapters in the new local plan. This report particularly looks at Chapter 3, the spatial strategy, Chapter 5, future growth and development on the western side of East Devon, Chapter 7 and 7B, which relate to climate emergency and climate change, and Chapter 13, protecting and enhancing our outstanding biodiversity and geodiversity. God, that's a tongue twister. As with the previous chapters, what we sought to do is try and slimline the policies, remove any superfluous text, strip policies back where reasonable to address any planning and determination of planning application matters, and remove policies or parts of policies that duplicate national guidance in the NPPF text. And then you'll see, starting at section 3, there's some more detailed comments about changes to the specific chapters before you today. I suggest we go through sort of chapter by chapter, and chapter 3, the spatial strategy, is the first one on the agenda. In terms of changes here, I guess the most notable ones are the designated neighbourhood area housing requirement has been separated out into its own standalone policy with a table setting out those figures, which you'll see haven't been populated yet, but because they needed to be populated after your determinations on the allocations, which obviously didn't complete until Friday, so that's work that's ongoing to populate that table. The other big changes or larger scale changes are deletion of strategic policy 5, which I think we touched on Friday in terms of mixed use developments and focusing mixed use developments in specific larger scale allocations rather than having a more general policy about mixed uses. And there's some redrafting of policies in particular in relation to developments inside and outside of settlement boundaries. So I think those are the key headlines. The chapter revised drafting of chapter 3 is in agenda as appendix 3. So ask members to Suggest we go through that chapter and happy to pick up any questions as we go.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Freeman. Outside committee first then, Councillor Faithful.
Thank you, Chair. This removing part of the draft local plan kind of reminds me of an issue I had some time ago about minimum space standards. And I put it as an issue for a planning application, and I was told at the time we couldn't use that as a reason for refusal because we do not have a policy for that. So I had to go through the whole process of a motion and bringing it through into the council. So I'm concerned about this comments here about taking things out of our proposed local plan because they're in a national things. Well, minimum space standards was in place as a national thing, but it wasn't in our policies, so we were rejecting it. We didn't accept it as a planning issue. So how can we be sure that the things we're taking out mean we can't actually have that as a subject long term in our planning policies, our planning going forward? Thank you.
Through you, Chair, I think the issue with the space standards was that they were an optional standard, so we needed a policy in order to actually enact that. I think that changed, which is why our position changed. But there is a policy in relation to space standards, I think, in the housing chapter from memory. So that is in there. I don't think we're proposing to take out anything fundamental, but I'd take the point that, you know, there's always going to be an element of duplication with national policy. I think it's really just where statutory consultees have raised concerns that it's an unnecessary level of detail, perhaps in terms of duplication, or perhaps there's elements of conflict in terms of differing wording and interpretation. So it's something to be mindful of, I think, as we go through. But we obviously don't want to take the point. We don't want to lose anything that's particularly important and locally significant through, and just rely on national guidance if there's a need for local policy that's that makes sense for East Devon.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Freeman. Any other comments from outside committee on this chapter? Okay, we come into committee then. Councillor Ingham.
Yeah, I'm interested about the, DNAHR table omission. It's a bit difficult to agree a chapter when some of the primary data is omitted. Is it going to come back to us, or, you know, that's my concern, or one of my concerns. The other one is, you know, the strategic policy for housing distribution. There's why are we well, I can read what you've said. Is it necessary to remove that policy? Yeah, my question for Mr. Freeman, Chair.
So in terms of the designated neighbourhood area housing requirement figures, you'll note the first column in that table is basically the sum of, you know, what's anticipated to be coming forward, so consents and allocations. Obviously, we didn't know for sure what allocations would be made until the end of Friday's meeting when you agreed the last of the allocations. So it wasn't possible to populate that column for this agenda. But you will obviously see this chapter again when it comes back on the 11th of December with the Regulation 19 version of the plan, and we will have that column populated by then for members to agree those final figures. But that column is a factual thing in the sense that it's the sum of all known supply sources, so completions, commitments and allocations. So I take your point. You need to see that and agree that finally, which will happen on the 11th of December. But that column is fact rather than something that necessarily needs. I would suggest comment on necessarily. In terms of strategic policy 2, isn't it? Housing distribution.
Yeah, page 23.
Yeah. I mean, I haven't got the wording as to what it actually said, but it was basically for consultation purposes of explaining the distribution strategy for housing. That's obviously now going to come forward in the plan and manifest itself in the allocations that are being made through the plan. So the argument is there's no need to have that necessarily, and it's certainly not a policy because it's more of a description rather than a policy with requirements. So the information is all still in the plan. It's just we don't see the need to have it as a strategic policy in that sense. It was more there to draw attention to it for consultation purposes.
Thank you, Mr. Freeman. Councillor Levine, then Councillor Bailey, then Councillor Young.
Ben, can you turn your... Thank you. Thank you, Chair. I was just wondering about what are our relations with the Exeter Economic Area? How do we fit into it? Have we broken relations with them? Are we cooperating with them? Because if we're going to put a lot of, as the report says, a lot of effort into the West End, we really need to be speaking to Exeter and Teignbridge and all the other areas. And secondly, I've told you this before the meeting started, I have trouble with one word in the document of page 3, on page 33, and it's the word equitable. We are trying to have a sustainable and equitable economy, but when I read this thing, our economy is not equitable. There are enormous income differences across the area. We're talking about rural economy, we're talking about service economy, we're talking about high-level jobs in the West End. We're being pragmatic, we're being expedient, but I can't see that we're being equitable. I wonder if you could help me out. Thank you.
Certainly, I mean, on the first point, yes, we are working with Exeter, Teignbridge and Mid Devon. We can continue to work closely with them as we have done for many years, and we form part of the wider Exeter economic area. So we need to have that coordinated approach. So that is part of the strategy and the evidence, particularly in terms of employment need and spaces through the economic development needs assessment was produced on that wider geography to pick up on those issues. So it requires a coordinated approach, and obviously under the duty to cooperate, we need to continue to work with those neighbouring authorities. So that's happening. Obviously, we're on different timelines in terms of local plans. Teignbridge's plan is currently at examination. Exeter are working on a plan pretty much the same timetable as us. So we've obviously responded to consultations to them, and those responses have come through this committee. So there is quite a coordinated approach. Members may recall from previous reports that there is some concern with Exeter's strategy that sees the redevelopment of some employment sites within the city and whether they can therefore meet the employment needs identified in the economic development needs assessment for the city. So we'll have to see how they respond to our previous comments in their next iteration of their plan, which should be coming out for consultation around the same time as ours. So we can comment on each other's and coordinate from there. But yeah, that's certainly something we're working with them on. In terms of the use of the word equitable, I was going to try and identify exactly where that word is used.
Under economic vision and strategy. Second line of economic vision and strategy.
Apologies, I just find that. I'm more than happy to look at the wording and how we can change that. I'm just trying to remember how that wording came to be used.
I'm not asking you to do it now, I'm just asking, well, I don't think that that is the right word to use in that context.
Mm. So I haven't found the reference.
Councillor Ingham?
In fairness, it says not that we have this, but we have a vision to create that. And I think the aspiration of having an equitable economy is correct. The fact we're not there is the reason why perhaps it's in our vision to raise average incomes away from the poverty line. I think that's commendable.
Yes, so apologies, I found the reference now, and I think it's effectively quoting from the council's economic development strategy. And I think Councillor Ingham's right. I think the key word there is vision. That this is where we're trying to get to. We're not there yet. I suppose the challenge that you're raising is whether or not the local plan helps to get us to a more equitable economy. I think there's challenges there in terms of the sort of economic makeup of the district. We've got obviously the West End that's very closely related to Exeter and benefits from that sort of Exeter branding, the location close to the main strategic road network, the airports and links to things like Exeter University for the science park and things that tends to create higher valued, higher skilled jobs as compared to some other parts of the district, and that's a challenge. I think through the local plan, the main thing is to ensure that we're allocating sufficient employment land across the district. And I think we've got a mix of employment sites, not just in the West End, but around the towns. We tried to make sure each town has land coming forward, either as a standalone employment allocation or as part of a large mixed-use development, to ensure that there's employment land coming forward alongside housing and other uses in each of the towns. But we need to work through corporately in terms of what we're doing in terms of each of those settlements through economic development and through regeneration work and things. We've obviously allocated, for example, a lot of land in Axminster, for example, and there are issues in Axminster in terms of transport movement through the town that we know about, potential regeneration projects in parts of the town that need to be progressed. I think we need to improve things like walking and cycling links around the town as well. And obviously we need to bring forward those employment sites in the town as well, although there are a number of employment sites in Axminster already, but there are further opportunities there certainly. So there's work we need to do in terms of delivering this strategy and ensuring that those employment sites come forward and are delivered across the district and not just in the West End, but also I think more corporately in terms of work we need to do off the back of this plan in terms of development of those towns and settlements, particularly to the east of the district, where the economy is perhaps struggling more than in the West End and needs a bit more support and help to bring sites forward and develop and create the higher levels of self-containment, which I think is also part of what we're trying to achieve here.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Freeman.
Thank you for answering my next question before I asked.
Very, very good. Councillor Bailey.
Thank you very much. I would like to talk about policies SPO6, development inside settlement boundaries, and that's SPO5, and SPO6, development beyond settlement boundaries. Or rather, I would hope that we will not be discussing these today because I understood it that boundaries were going to be discussed on the 22nd of November in our meeting. And I've been down this route before, not with our current chair, but about 3 chairs before of this committee, where actually we disaggregated, so we separated boundary policies and principles from the actual boundaries themselves, and ended up the officers ended up drawing boundaries which weren't ever drawn to our attention and caused a great deal of upset in my ward and probably other wards. We've got a lot of parishes that have expressed their views on boundaries, including Hawkchurch, Lympstone, Newton Bodford, West Hill, Honiton, Exmouth, and I think we need to deal with it collectively, the principles and the actual red lines which the officers have drawn. So I hope that councillors will support me and move on, if that's the correct, if we can still use that phrase, and bring this back on the 22nd of November so that we can look at boundaries in the whole and not have a principles discussion today and then lines drawn and brought back by officers on the 22nd, because I don't believe that that's the right approach, and I believe that we should be discussing it all together in one meeting on the 22nd. Thank you.
Mr. Freeman.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, so I'm not precious. If members want to park discussion of those policies until when you have the boundaries in front of you, that's fine. This is another issue of sequencing of events, in that obviously we couldn't draw the boundaries until such time as the allocations had been agreed, and obviously that only happened on Friday, so there hasn't been an opportunity to draw those boundaries, although someone is frantically working away on that as we speak. So happy if that's what members want to do. I would, however, highlight that the reason why we've brought those policies, and I think it would be acceptable to discuss them today if members are so minded, is that the principles really are quite straightforward, in that development within the settlement boundaries would be acceptable in principle, and development outside of the boundaries would not be acceptable in principle. And that is the same principle that's in the current local plan. So regardless of where the boundaries actually are drawn, I think those principles would stand. But if members are concerned about the sequence of events and the tie-in between the boundaries and the policies, happy to bring those policies back as part of the report on the settlement boundaries on the 22nd.
What do you think, Councillor Bailey?
I think we should deal with it as its own discrete topic altogether. When we've got everybody, so that actually the parishes, we haven't got many parishes here today, and I suspect that actually, it would help our engagement with the parishes if, rather than on the 22nd, we're presenting a fait accompli, as in, this is our policy, this is our boundary. I think it's better to have it as a more kind of collegiate approach and to have it all done at the same time in one go.
Okay, in which case then I'll move from the chair that we defer consideration of strategic policies SP05 and SP06 until the meeting on the 22nd of November. All those in favour of that, please. Those against? And those abstaining? 2. So that's clearly carried. Okay. In which case then, the remainder of Chapter 3. Any comments, members? Councillor Ewing. Sorry, thank you for waiting.
I'm just stuck on the introduction to start off with, because it reads like a builder's charter. Yeah, I agree that we need to be concise and we need to be as short as possible. Why are we doing it? And what are the reasons why? For instance, in policy 01, we're saying the western side of the district. I hope we're going to have a map to describe where the western side is, because a developer in London will look at the map and read something different, and because Exmouth is in the western side of it, but I don't think we're talking about that. In the last plan, it was the West End, I think we were describing it at, and developers kept saying, oh, this village and that village is in the West End. was miles away. So we need a better definition of where we're concentrating the development, and we need to explain why we're having that development close to Exeter.
Are you suggesting, Councillor Young, that we need to bring another boundary to the 22nd to define the West End? Or is that going too far?
I don't think we need a boundary, but we need to have it as shaded, possibly.
Well, the shading has to have an edge, Jeff.
I know, but no, it goes into detail of Cranbrook and the new town. I wish we had a name for the new town rather than just calling it new town. That's something else. And major strategic developments close to Exeter. We need to define those. In A, I think we need to define it a lot better. Whereas we're going to have developers, no, they'll be moving the western side more east.
Through Chair, I mean, happy to take away an action to look at that. I certainly take the point that it's perhaps not particularly well defined. I think we kind of probably know in this room where we're talking about, but I take your point, a developer from London might take a different interpretation of what western side of East Devon means, or I think we kind of dropped West End, but it's always been a slightly fuzzy boundary, I suppose. So to put a hard line on a map might be more challenging, but we can certainly look at how we can explain that either in text or in some kind of plan form. I think the term kind of originates in the structure plan, if I recall, and there was a sort of fuzzy boundary in there somewhere in years gone by, so we can see what we can do to address that concern, certainly.
I have Councillors Brian Bailey, then Brown, then Jess Bailey, then Ingham.
Thank you, Chair. Before I start, I tend to agree with Councillor Young. You can't put down a strategic plan without a boundary. It's just nonsensical. You have to have a definition of where the west is, where the east is, where the central is. And that's how the planning system's worked for years, but with no definite boundary. It seems rather fortunate we've got so far without a definite boundary. Just by chance, I guess. So I support what Councillor Young said on there. My question, Chair, is the lack of transport infrastructure. We have these new towns coming up, and we're going to have massive amounts of traffic, because while everybody's hopefully going to go on electric vehicles, they still have to run on the road. They still have to get there. You know, they're not the all-seeing, dancing answer to everything. They are possibly to the pollution side of things, but transport is very, very poor in the West End at the moment. I define the West End as alongside the River Exe for perhaps a mile or two inland, for my purposes. The only decent train is from Exmouth to Tottenham. Well, if you're going to put the new village where it's going to be, people have to get to the train station. It's too far to walk, definitely. Even in my unfit state, I couldn't walk that far. It'd be a struggle. Pointless as well, getting children to school. You know, all these things have got to be considered, and I don't think they've been considered enough. So I have a vision in the future, well, I should be long gone by then, no doubt, that all these towns are putting here, and it's just going to create utter chaos on the roads. The rails won't be able to cope, and there's going to be literally thousands of people going from the Cliff St George area to Topsham to catch a train to go to Exeter, where we ought to be planning our employment land this side of the motorway, so that people haven't got to go to Exeter to work. There's enough people going to Exeter to work at the moment. We ought to be developing our own areas, which we have with the science park to a degree, and make it even larger, so that people haven't got to do all the travelling. The whole idea of trying to keep things carbon neutral is you travel less, not more. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Bailey. Mr. Freeman, your thoughts?
Well, certainly we need to develop a transport strategy for the new community, and that's something that we've already had discussions with Devon County on, and how that would work. So that's in train, if you pardon the pun. And sorry, that wasn't intentional. And and I think, I mean, I fully take your point about the mix of uses, but I think that's something we have built into the policy for the new town about ensuring that there are employment spaces within the new town so that people can live and work in close proximity to each other. And there are obviously a range of employment spaces nearby, which is part of the reason why that option 1 site was selected above the others, was because it has a closer relationship with existing employment sites, both to the south in terms of Hillbarton and Greendale, but also to the north with the business parks around the airport, Sky Park and Science Park, and opportunities to create public transport corridors that run north to south through that area and help to distribute people to those locations, as well as good walking and cycling routes. Particularly, I think cycling routes to those employment sites could be quite a good way of moving people in a sustainable way to some of those sites which aren't actually that far if you create attractive cycling routes. And we have seen quite a high take-up of cycling, for example, from Cranbrook to those sites and onwards into the city, as well, by creating safe and attractive cycling routes that are off-road for those uses. So I think a lot of that is in the strategy. There's a level of detail that perhaps isn't there yet, which we need to work up partly through the master planning process for the new community, and then onwards into development of a transport strategy in partnership with Devon County Council. But all those things are in motion. We're working on that. So I think those concerns will ultimately be addressed through the work we're doing.
Very briefly, yes.
We've always stated in the past, infrastructure first. Infrastructure first. Well, here's an opportunity where we can, as you say, with the Highways Authority in Devon County, create the infrastructure first. Then we've got that created. Then we've got a skeleton to hang the new town on. But at the moment, it appears we're hanging the new town in the space where it tends to go, but there's no infrastructure. So why can't we do it the other way around as we've always intended to do? This is a golden opportunity to do that, Mr. Freeman. Thank you.
So there's very much an intention to deliver infrastructure up front as much as is possible. A lot of that comes down to the delivery vehicle that we use to deliver the new town, and there's a lot of work going on. You may be aware, in parallel with the master plan, with consultants working on developing a business case and looking at delivery vehicles and how we could bring forward the new town in a way that does deliver infrastructure first and delivers the mix of infrastructure, employment and community facilities early in the build out, and certainly in parallel with the housing coming forward. So we're learning that lesson from Cranbrook, and there's a more equitable distribution, is that word again, between the different uses coming forward. So that's all work that's ongoing, but obviously that infrastructure first approach you mentioned needs money first as well. And so that comes back to the delivery vehicle and how we're delivering this. And that will rely on an ask of government ultimately in terms of funding for all of that. But we have consultants working on that in terms of the business case and the delivery vehicle, so that hopefully we can make a strong case to them when the time comes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Freeman. Thank you, Councillor Bailey. Councillor Brown, I have you next on my list. Are we coming back to talk about policies in the chapter? If the answer is no, I'm going to skip you.
No, I was just going to, Brian took the words out of my mouth, so I'll keep quiet for the moment.
Thank you. Councillor Jess Bailey, again, are we back to policy?
Yeah, we're on policy 1. I completely agree with Councillor Young, because actually, to my mind, the western side of the district, that wording suggests a really large area, whereas to my mind, it's actually quite a constrained area, a limited area. So that needs to be really clearly shown on a map, I think. My second comment is that there's no distinction. We've gone along with this hierarchy of settlements, and there was a distinction between the principal centre at Exmouth and the main centres. And actually, that hasn't really come through in this strategy, because if you compare, say, Ottery St Mary with Exmouth, there's clearly a vast number of more dwellings and facilities such as the train station. We've always separated out Exmouth, yet we've got our fundamental policy here which lumps them all into category B, and I don't believe that that's correct. I believe that our hierarchy of settlement should be set out in this policy, and we should have a clear approach to the levels of development depending on the tier of the settlement. So that's my second point. My final point is around local needs in paragraph D. It's never been clear to me the basis on which we've evidenced local need. So, for instance, we've been happily or unhappily, I should think, allocating sites across these these service villages, which to my mind only have limited facilities. So, for instance, Fennerton, 120 houses. Where is the evidence that Fennerton needs 120 houses to meet its local needs, and how are we going to evidence that? Because I don't believe the evidence is there. Thank you.
So I think in terms of the first point, I think it's a good point. We have been treating Exmouth as a sort of principal settlement on its own in terms of settlement hierarchy. So can quite legitimately see a case for making that a sort of point B in strategic policy SPO 1 on its own, and then C being the main centres, Axminster, Oniton, Ottery, St Mary, Seaton, Sidmouth, and then D, the local centres, and E, the service villages. So if members feel that that's the way to go, I can see that as a legitimate case for that. We've certainly treated Exmouth as a principal centre above the main centres, and that isn't reflected in the current drafting. So I think that's a good point. In terms of Fennerton, and I suppose this is almost a question back to the committee, I suppose, in terms of Fennerton and possibly other settlements, we've perhaps ended up allocating a scale of growth that spatial strategy didn't initially identify because of constraints further up the settlement hierarchy that have meant that in order to meet the housing numbers, we've had to go for higher levels of growth, particularly in Fennerton. That was highlighted in the consultation. You'll recall the draft plan consultation consulted on whether or not higher levels of growth should be accommodated at Fennerton or Wimpole. I think as things have turned out, perhaps at Fennerton we've not gone for the strategic levels of growth that the consultation sought views on, but potentially for a slightly higher level of growth than perhaps local needs. But as you identify, we haven't got that granular level of needs data in terms of housing needs to say precisely a particular need. In a lot of these settlements, it's about what we feel is an appropriate scale of growth in those locations, which came through the discussion we've had over previous weeks in terms of the allocations in those locations. So I don't think the decisions that have been made in terms of allocations necessarily undermine the principles set out in there. It is a limited level of growth, and Fennerton is one of the larger service villages. But whether members feel that that and perhaps other settlements where a higher level of growth has been allocated need to be treated separately in the spatial strategy, I'm open to discussion and hearing views on that.
Can I come back to you on that, please? I think if I was, which I'm not, the inspector, I would look at that paragraph and I would say, right, this is your first strategy. Point D, to meet local needs. Where's your evidence? Now, if you want to change the wording so that it says to meet an appropriate level of development or whatever, that's maybe okay, but we can't leave it in there saying local needs when we've got no evidence. I mean, it's in our first strategy. That's not great, is it?
Yep, I take your point. I'm not sure that an inspector would be overly concerned about that, but I can see that the wording is perhaps slightly misleading for some settlements. Happy to look at that in terms of an alternative word. Allowing limited development to meet an appropriate need of the service within an appropriate level. We can certainly look at that if members are concerned.
I think I probably speak for committee when I say yes, members are concerned. Please have a look at it. I will carry on through my list then. I have Councillor Ingham next.
Thank you, Chair. Of the problems that we're discussing today are a result of not addressing and considering what would go into chapters 1 to 7 about 2 or 3 years ago. That was a profound mistake because, yes, our concerns today reflect the problem of not dealing with the first 7 chapters at the start of creating a new local plan. An example of that, page 45, new policy strategy SPO7, delivery of infrastructure, considered on the 5th of November 2024. It's profound. That tells me that we're not doing things correctly. The transport strategy should have been considered in depth and agreed 2 or 3 years ago. And this, the fact that it isn't, makes chapter 3 appear inarticulate. Part of that was driven by the leadership of this council 4 years ago, deciding to move away from being part of what was then GESP, which primary concern was to consider, identify, deliver infrastructure. Not only did we walk away from it then, you can see that by failing to address these chapters 3 years ago, we're now looking at things that, I've put down here, writing the rules after you've made the decision. That's profoundly wrong, and it does sound, and we've had a few examples already this morning where we're saying, well, we can't put in there, about parochial needs and evidence of it when we haven't got any. Can I remind you that 10 years ago when we did the last plan, one of the first things we did was to go to parishes, the villages, identify their needs and say, we think you should be delivering this, is this agreed? And it really worked well. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. This time, I would suggest we're perhaps inadvertently ignoring local need, ignoring responses through public consultation, and 3 years after the event, we're trying to start addressing infrastructure needs and requirements when we've already identified housing allocation. So we shouldn't be surprised if over the next 10 years we have extreme difficulty in delivering these because it is inarticulate. Thank you, Chair.
It's not the first time you've made this comment in recent weeks, Councillor Ingham. So a question from me to you then. How do you write a transport strategy before you know where you're going to build a new town?
Well, first of all, Chair, you decide whether you want a new town, which we should have decided three or 4 years ago, and everyone being involved in that. We did not do that. What we did was decide we wanted a new town, and now we're trying to work out what the infrastructure will be. What we should have done is to discuss this in full with Exeter City Council and our other partners at that time and say, what is our overall need for infrastructure? What is our overall need for housing supply for 5 years within Greater Exeter? And then we could have balanced that out. And I think you'll find that you're going to have a nasty surprise very soon in the next few years when Exeter turn up saying, well, we need. And we haven't really discussed and agreed what of their needs we can address and those which we can't. And it's a great shame because we could have done that a long time ago. Now we're deciding to build out on housing allocations.
I'm going to stop you there, Councillor Ingham, because you're not answering my question. How do you know what infrastructure is needed to support a new town when you don't know where the new town is going and therefore what infrastructure is already there?
Well, you need to decide, first of all, I'd say, because Exeter is at the centre of the core settlement within Devon. First of all, you've got to say, well, is there a new town needed in East Devon at all if we consider the rest of the districts around Exeter? And it could be that you need one. But because we didn't have that grand vision of how the infrastructure would work for Exeter and environs, in isolation, we're saying, well, we're going to have a new town, but we'll do that later. In the meantime, we'll do a patchwork quilt around us.
I'm going to
which
move
is
us on
what you've
because
just
this
done.
isn't a constructive discussion. Relitigating the argument over GESP, which admittedly was before my time, is not a productive use of this committee's time today. So we're going to move on, and I will come to Councillor Davey. Do you have a comment about the policies that are in the chapter?
No, probably not. But it is about infrastructure. So just a quick response to Councillor Bailey, because I've got to say his vision of the future fills me with despair, because it tells me that we have been totally unable to make the collective leap of vision to get away from the private motor car. But he asserts it's too far to walk to the station. Actually, I walked to the station on Friday morning, 25 minutes with my wife, and we walked back when the train arrived back on Sunday evening. We went to Bristol by train. And then there's these newfangled things called buses that are actually surprisingly reliable. The 96 that goes near me is very reliable. And when they're not reliable, I've got to say, that is mainly due to the amount of traffic on the road.
I'm sure committee is fascinated to hear about this new invention, Councillor Davey, but in the interest of time, could we perhaps move on?
Okay, I just wanted to say infrastructure can be delivered alongside development, and the infrastructure we need is not more roads, but it's bus stops, bus routes, cycle routes, electric charging, and space for pool cars in developments. And all of that can be designed through a master plan. I don't see how we can design the transport master plan until we know the shape of the new town. But we know where it's going to be, and I thought the decision had been made that we were going to have a new town, and that we knew where it was going to be. I thought we'd made that decision.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Davey. Councillor Young, do you have a comment about policies in the chapter?
Yes, I do.
Please proceed.
But before I do that, I just want to go over the GESP.
No. We're talking about chapter policies in the chapter, please, Jeff.
Go over. No, my memory of the GESP is totally different
I'd really rather
to
you
Ben's
didn't, because I don't
memory, and I've considered it to be a total stitch-up for the districts and to the benefit of Exeter. But that's where we are. But I'm really pleased to see SB07. Which is new policy delivery of infrastructure. However, I think we need to build on it to some extent. I'm worried about where appropriate the council will use planning conditions or planning obligations to secure the provision of infrastructure. Now, one of the infrastructures that is very lacking at the moment is sewage and water supply. And if I'm quite concerned that are we going to use SIL money or obligation 106 money to support a private company who is supposed to be supplying that service through their own finances? So that's my main concern with that. But I think we need to also consider now trying to get funding from government as well. It doesn't include now limiting ourselves to 106 and SIL and not looking further afield for finances, like levelling up funding we haven't mentioned. So I think we need to build on that a little bit and also look at should National Highways provide some funding? Should it all come from ourselves? And also the key issue is the sewage, obviously. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Young. Mr. Freeman has written that down, so I think that's a point that can be taken away. Councillor Young, could you perhaps reflect separately whether it's appropriate to be calling one of your councillor colleagues an idiot in public session? Thank you. I next have Councillor Levine.
Thank you, Chair. I'm trying to shoehorn my comment into a policy, but it's just a suggestion. On the bottom of page 22, there is a map of East Devon, and it seems to me it's extremely easy just to put in crosshatches to show where the West End is.
I think Mr. Freeman has got that point, and it will be taken up.
But the other thing is, what worries me a little bit about it, it's also to do with strategy, with SB7, we're telling we've got all our principal centres, we've got our local centres, and we've got open countryside, where people will be able to build if they come up with local community-led projects. Well, the most problem with that is, many of our communities, settlements, small settlements who would like to do that, haven't got a critical mass to come and formulate all the necessary policies that are needed. Are we going to provide them with any sort of help? Is that somewhere in our plan?
I'm not sure that would be a matter for the local plan, but we provide support via our neighbourhood planning officer. There's government grants through locality and so on. So there is a package of support that's there, but I'm not sure it would be planning policy. Mr. Freeman, anything to add?
No, I don't think it would be something for the local plan. It's not a policy, but as you say, Chair, it is happening. We have a neighbourhood planning officer whose role is to support neighbourhood planning initiatives across the district. There's a lot of funding out there and support through various bodies and government funding for neighbourhood planning. If your community or any other communities want help, come and talk to us and we'll do what we can to support them.
I can't imagine which communities you're thinking about there, Councillor Levine. Councillor Jess Bailey.
Thank you. I think we know what infrastructure is, but I think there is a bit, I think we should be spelling it out, shouldn't we? Be saying what we actually mean by infrastructure. So that's one point. The second point I want to make, and this may, I think it could come under this strategy, but what I feel is that we want to have a policy, and this is something that Councillor Barlow has raised with me, because he couldn't be here today, to make sure that when developments happen, we can effectively charge the developers for ongoing maintenance and, their own infrastructure in terms of making sure they deliver very energy efficient properties, making sure that they are complying on an ongoing basis with their ecology requirements. So building that into at this stage to make sure that the infrastructure can be, their obligations are monitored, because it seems to be we don't have the resources, do we? And frankly, some developers get away with a lot. And we need to put in a policy that enables us to charge from the outset under Section 106 to make sure that they are developing in accordance with their energy requirements, that they are meeting their ecology requirements, that they are planting the trees and maintaining them. So can we have that right in a big policy right at the outset in our local plan, so that, because we're under-resourced, aren't we? We can't do it at the moment properly. So can we have that in our local plan? If not in this section, in another section?
I suspect charging for planning enforcement would probably require primary legislation, wouldn't it, Mr. Freeman, rather than being a policy?
That's right, Chair. We can't charge for planning enforcement, but we do charge Section 106 monitoring fees already. I brought a report through committee and scrutiny committee last September, was it, I think, setting out a new charging schedule for monitoring fees, and it's on the basis of predicted income for that, as well as the SIL admin charges that we can charge as part of our SIL charging schedule that we're funding the planning obligations team that is now in place, 5 officers to oversee the administration and monitoring of Section 106 and SIL obligations. So we do have the resources now to do that effectively, and the income coming in through those charges to pay for that. So I don't think there's a need for anything in terms of policy. It's a recent thing having those resources in place, but have worked hard over the last year or so to come up with the means through those charges to fund that and to recruit to the posts. And we have an excellent team in post who are working through sort of backlog of issues there and getting up to speed with that and ensuring that we're in a strong position to monitor Section 106 obligations moving forward and ensure that we're collecting the SIL and payments needed.
You look dissatisfied, Councillor Bailey.
In terms of energy efficiency, can we monitor that? How do we monitor that? So it's a really fundamental thing in terms of the climate emergency and carbon. How do we monitor that? Can we put obligations in our Section 106 agreements? Can we be broader in what we recover from developers so that we can monitor their ongoing delivery in terms of energy efficiency?
So when we get to the relevant policies, you'll see that as per previous resolution of the committee, we're largely relying on sort of building regulations and the Future Home Standard. So that will be administered and enforced through building regulations rather than the planning process. There are some additional elements in terms of, making sure properties are, for example, solar PV ready, that will need some monitoring because they would form part of planning obligations, and it would be for the planning obligations team to ensure that we have evidence that those commitments have been met.
Councillor Arnott, did you have any declarations to make? No? Okay, thank you. I have come to the end of my list of people I had wanting to speak. Are there any further issues that haven't been brought up with any of the policies that are in this chapter? I'm braced for Mike to put his hand up and throw it.
Move the chapter.
Okay. Well, in which case then, Mr. Freeman has a long list of notes from that discussion. So I will. What's the recommendation that's set out in the report? I will move that we endorse the proposed revised draft chapter 3, subject to the comments that we've had, to be moved towards readiness for the Regulation 19 plan. All those in favour, please. Those against? Those abstaining? Okay, thank you. That's carried. We're going to take a short break before we do chapter 5, as we'll be going an hour and a quarter now, so we'll resume at 25 past. Okay, welcome back, members. We move on then to the next chapter under agenda item 7, chapter 5, the western side of East Devon. Mr. Freeman.
Thank you, Chair. So obviously taking on board the point about defining the western side of East Devon, which will obviously relate equally to this chapter. We've done some redrafting of this chapter, as you can see. The main changes, obviously, we start to look at the new town policy and try to develop that a bit further. So there's a new iteration of that, one which refers to meanwhile uses, which we know from experience at Cranbrook can be important to get in place. Facilities and services early doors. Another thing to say in terms of that particular policy is the issue around numbers. So you'll see there's 2 blank spaces in terms of the numbers of new homes. The only reason for that has been discussions that have been ongoing about relationship between our proposals and the government's emerging New Towns programme, which members may be aware of. It's opened yesterday for sort of expressions of interest as well, in terms of New Town proposals being put forward to the group that are taking that forward for the government. So there is a slight mismatch in terms of, we've always talked about 8,000 new homes in terms of our New Town, whereas the New Towns programme is 10,000. So we are looking at how we deal with that. I think the current thinking is that we need to allocate 8,000. That's what we said we would do as part of this plan and what we've consulted on. But there's no reason why the plan couldn't set out a vision for a larger new community to align with the New Towns programme and potentially look at 10,000 or more new homes as a vision for the future beyond this plan period. Obviously, as we previously discussed, only about 2,500 homes would actually be built in this plan period anyway. And I think it would take until about 2055 to build out the 8,000 that we've previously consulted on and engaged on through this process. But in terms of the New Towns programme, it would appear that settlements would need to be 10,000 or more. So we're looking at how we can incorporate that into plan and potentially have a vision for a new town in excess of 8,000 and how that could be accommodated. So hence the gaps in the policy at the moment, but be interested to hear members' views on that so that we can take that away and feed that into the next iteration of that. Other particular changes in this chapter, we've obviously deleted the policy that related to the employment site north of Sowton Village, as that was not agreed for allocation. Redrafted other policies in relation to allocations in that area to reflect previous discussions. And the Cliffs Valley Regional Park policy has been refined to be more specific about provision requirements in association with development. I think those are the main things to pick up on. Obviously, you've now got policy wording also for the development north of Topsham, which members agreed to allocate obviously on Friday. So we'd previously done some work with Exeter City Council about wording of that, picking up on the needs for a master plan and coordinated joint approach across the boundaries there. Hopefully that's a useful introduction. Happy to pick up any questions and points as we go through.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Freeman. Starting outside committee. No. Okay, coming into committee then, Councillor Young.
Yeah, I can't. The ongoing development and potential expansion of Cranbrook, it says the Cranbrook plan, and it says to be adopted in autumn 2022. I think we have adopted it in 2022, so just a slight tweak there.
Thank you, Jeff. Good spot. Councillor Young.
Sorry, Chairman, I'll lean forward. Reflecting on the need for another new town and our target of 8,000 and the potential for 10,000, I'd like Mr. Freeman to reflect on the risk, potential risk, if we were to say, well, if we increase our target to 10,000, surely the allocations we've gone through don't need to be as high as they are. That would be one option. Or the other option would be to say we'll keep all the allocations we've just gone through. It was hard work. And we won't increase the 8,000, or we'll do both. We'll do both. Yeah, we'll go for the strategically for the extra 2,000, and we could increase the life of our plan potentially. Could we do that?
Through you, Chair, the 8 or 10,000 makes absolutely no difference to the allocations you've agreed. You will only see about 2,500, a few more, having added actually 2 years to the plan, but certainly no more than 3,000 absolute tops homes delivered in this plan period to 2042. If we move from 8 to 10,000, then the additional 2,000 wouldn't be built till post 2055. Bear in mind this plan period only goes to 2042, so you couldn't take any other allocations out of the plan. You would need those as well. And all we're proposing to do is potentially set a sort of vision for how 10,000 would come forward. We could, and we're also looking at potentially how we identify an area adjacent to the proposed allocation for the new town where the additional could take place. So we're kind of setting the foundations for a future expansion of the new town in the next local plan. But it wouldn't be an allocation, because obviously the consultations and all of the work we've done, all of the evidence relates to 8,000. But equally, I don't think we want to miss the opportunity to be part of the New Towns programme, which potentially comes with a lot of funding and government support. So having a vision that looks beyond that, beyond the 8,000 to potentially 10,000 and beyond, I think is important in terms of the local plan alignment with that programme. And also goes back to what we said in the past about being clear from the outset about the total scale of development and planning for that from the start. So I think it's useful to have that in the plan.
Chair, based on that, it is that I've noticed right now and in past previous plans, as they emerge, we've become vulnerable through this 5-year land supply. Is it not feasible that we can, by including this target to 10,000, when we get to the end of the plan that we've got, we say, hey, we've already got 2,000, get off our backs, which would be, because it's already planned and it's dynamic enough that we can achieve it. That might be useful, I would have thought. Can that be a consideration?
I don't think it helps in the short term at all, but in the long term, obviously, and knowing where that scale of growth would be accommodated beyond this plan period, given that, as I've said, much of the new town, the second new town, would be built post 2042. We know where a fair chunk of our housing land supply will come in the future. So that gives us a more robust and resilient position moving forward in terms of housing and supply. But the new town is realistically only going to deliver a finite number each year. So it doesn't really help. It's in terms of 5-year housing and supply, it's more looking ahead into the future. We know where a proportion of that supply is going to come from in the years beyond 2042. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Ingham. Councillor Davey, is it a point about policy, or do you have another new invention to tell us about?
No, it's about policy this time. Thank you very much. On page 173, as part of the policy of the new town about jobs, there appears to be a missing line, because we've got how much, well, we haven't, but we have an aspiration to put a number in for the number of hectares of land that will be allocated before 2042 and beyond. And then there's a line that starts, employment shall be made throughout the town. And I feel as though that there should be a line before that says something like, space for employment shall be made throughout the town, or something like that. It just looks as though there's a missing line there, and it's a bit hard to understand. I get the intention, but just to point out that it doesn't quite make sense as it stands. I know it's not the final wording.
Thank you, Councillor Davey. Another good spot there. Any other comments about policies in this chapter, folks?
One last one. I discussed this with Mr. Freeman before, and this chapter is all about one area. I wouldn't want people, and I know Mr. Freeman doesn't think like this, wouldn't want people to think this is all about the West End and nothing, or little interest or commitment made for the rest of East Devon. I know that's not true. Does Mr. Freeman feel that we've put enough in here to link this chapter with others to say, we haven't forgotten Axminster, which as a fractile of Exeter has to have its, because it's potentially so sustainable, has to have its own micro policy of support from us, doesn't it? Are we doing enough to tie in the other communities, do you feel, as well as the West End, and to recognise their needs? We talked about the equitable economy throughout East Devon. It's important that we get this right, because we hopefully, through this chapter, will definitely improve the aspirations and achievements of local people in getting jobs in the West End. We know that in the national landscapes, the demographic of the population tends to be more senior in years than in comparison to Cranbrook. So we have to make sure that we don't just get good jobs in the West End, but we are supporting the local economies to make working people of working age, to be able to work in their local towns as well as travelling to the West End.
Happy to take away an action to check that is picked up. I think it's there somewhere, whether it's in this chapter or in the previous chapter in terms of the wider spatial strategy. But I think it's a fair point in terms of we need to make sure we're making those links, that what happens in the West End in terms of improvement in skills and knowledge does have wider benefits beyond that area in terms of the wider economy. So yeah, I would certainly take that away and check that there is some wording in there that picks up on those connections.
Thank you, Mr. Freeman. Any Councillor Young?
I can't find where it is now, but I wrote it down as a note, but it says town centre for the new town up to 2042, allocation of 15 acres of land for a town centre with completion of at least 5 acres of land with completed an operation, and it goes on. Can we be a bit more ambitious? Or, we seem to be limiting ourselves to just 5 hectares. Can we?
It does say at least.
No, yeah, no.
It's not a ceiling, Jeff.
Yeah. I know it says at least, but we know what happened with Cranbrook, and the centre of Cranbrook was very late. No, we need an accelerated town centre and not a decelerated town centre, if you see what I mean.
Mr. Freeman, how do we get F1 rather than F99? I've just offended motorsports fan.
Yes, I think to have 5 hectares of land within your town centre coming forward for town centre uses, including retail, in the same time scale that you'd have 2,500 homes coming forward, it is actually a fast track town centre in effect, because we've ended up with Cranbrook getting to, what are we, 3,500 homes now at least, I think, at Cranbrook. And I appreciate that's because the town centre's been delayed, but you need to get to a certain scale of residential to actually support those kind of uses. Obviously, some of it could be meanwhile uses, which I think is probably the intention here. But as the chair says, I think it's at least. So it would be nice to think that we'll be in a situation by 2042 to be able to deliver more than that, but there's obviously huge uncertainties between now and 2042 in terms of what would happen. And a lot of this comes down to the delivery vehicle and our ability to bring forward those kind of uses ahead of where there might be market demand for them. So it depends how aspirational we want to be, or how realistic we want to be. It's a trade-off, isn't it? I think in terms of a policy like this. So I think by putting at least, we're setting a benchmark and saying we will have at least 5 hectares of town centre land delivered. But surely if we can exceed that, we should.
I can't tell whether you want to follow that up or not, Jeff.
I feel that we're not being ambitious enough. I was involved in the Central Shopping Centre at Milton Keynes, and every retailer said, why the hell are you building a shopping centre in the middle of a field next to some concrete cows? But it is one of the most successful shopping centres in the country now. So I'm quite pleased that that was promoted very early on in the new town, and we possibly should be. I know it's not another Milton Keynes, thank goodness, but we should be doing as much as we can to provide the facilities at a very early date.
I think Mr. Freeman can take that point away and have a look at what the balance between appropriate and realistic and ambitious is.
Yeah, happy to take away an action to look at. I don't disagree with the sentiment. It's about how we balance that realism against ambition. Obviously, the retail sector in particular has changed massively since the early days of Milton Keynes. So I think what would have been achievable then is more difficult now with internet shopping and delivery services and things like that. But happy to take away that, as I say, this policy is still emerging through discussions we're having with consultants who are working on master plan and delivery vehicles, and will to some extent depend on how we're delivering the new community, which is still uncertain.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Freeman. Any other? Councillor Howe.
I've got to for a change. Following on from Councillor Young's point, the very next line, or the social, community and education facilities. I mean, it's great. Accommodate a full range of social, leisure, health, community and education facilities, including schools. It's great that a swimming pool is included in that, because you're not stating what we're going to provide or anything else, and they need a swimming pool between the two towns. I know Cranbrook's not going to get one, so I think the new one should be in this one. Balance of power, but as I say, it's the wording. We are going to accommodate a full range, so that's expected that it will be delivered. Are we being realistic or not?
I think it again comes back to how sort of prescriptive we want to be in terms of the policy, as well as how ambitious we want to be. I don't think it's yet resolved as to whether or not there'll be a swimming pool at Cranbrook. I think there's still very much ambition to have a swimming pool at Cranbrook if possible. So I wouldn't jump to the assumption that there wouldn't be. But equally, I question how prescriptive we want to be. I think we're talking about a full range of social, leisure, health, community and education facilities. Whether or not that includes a swimming pool, I think is something that needs to come out in the wash, really, in terms of the details, rather than be prescribed in policy.
Am I right in thinking that's the sort of thing that the master planning work is likely to pick up as well, outside of this kind of specific policy wording?
Well, with that and things like infrastructure delivery plan that's being developed for the new community as well, So all of those things need to be factored in and costed in. I'm sure in an ideal world, we would certainly want to see a leisure centre that includes a swimming pool at Newtown as we would at Cranbrook, but it's balancing that ambition with realism. And if there's one at Cranbrook, does there need to be one here and vice versa? That all needs is thinking through, but it's a level of detail I don't think we necessarily need to incorporate into local plan policy.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Freeman. Any further comments on policies in this chapter? No, okay, in which case then I'll move from the chair that we endorse the proposed draft revised chapter 5 to go forward for the Regulation 19 draft. All those in favour, please? That's unanimous. Okay, that brings us then to chapter 7A, Climate Emergency, Mr. Freeman.
Thank you, Chair. Just to flag, this obviously won't be chapter 7A when in the final version. I'm not proposing that we have A's and B's and things. It's just a factor of how the number works. So for a bit of background, we've got all of this set up as a Teams document, which is where sometimes the formatting goes a bit awry, and it's where some of the wording that you've highlighted is missing may have gone missing because we're having all sorts of formatting issues. So apologies for that, and that's the reason why this has come as 7A and 7B at this point in time. But the intention here is to have a chapter that's about sort of responding to climate emergency and talks about energy efficiency and renewables and those issues, as opposed to the adaptation to climate change and climate change resilience, which would be in a separate chapter now. So this chapter focuses on things like the design standards for new homes. So you'll see we followed the previous report that I think came to the committee in February, was it, about how we incorporate building regulations and work alongside the Future Homes Standard to seek the highest standards for new homes, policies for renewable energy generating schemes, which we've reviewed as part of the work, tried to combine them into a single policy. An energy storage policy, which was picked up in one of the speakers earlier. I think they made some very good points in terms of the details of how those schemes need to come forward and be considered. I think it's probably a level of detail that we don't necessarily need to put in policy, and is perhaps more for a future guidance note. And in some cases, it's just part of process in terms of who we're consulting. It doesn't need to be in a policy document. We'll certainly take on board those points. So yeah, that's chapter 7A. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Freeman. Outside committee first then, Councillor McKinder.
Thank you, Chair. That wasn't nice. Can I start with just a couple of very short questions, and I've got some more substantive points on the two policy.
I think we can accommodate that.
Okay. CTO 2.1 under there, it refers to nationally important landscapes. Am I correct to assume that means or includes national landscapes with capital letters? And if so, can it be capitalised to kind of underline that?
Did you mean CCO3, Duncan?
CCO3, I did, yeah, sorry.
Sorry, I'm struggling to find the reference, but I mean, if it's a reference to national landscapes, it should be capitalised.
Yeah, it just says nationally important landscapes, and I wasn't sure if that meant national landscapes as in what used to be AONBs or...
Yes, it certainly will include national landscapes. Yeah, we can look at the wording. It would make more sense to just say national landscapes, capitalised, I think, rather than nationally important landscapes, which are the national landscapes.
Point 2 under that, it says allow for the continuation of the site of some form of appropriate agricultural activity or biodiversity use. Am I correct to assume that applies to both energy generation and energy storage sites?
So is this still in CCO3?
Correct. Yeah, it's the next point down behind that one.
So there's a separate policy on energy storage, which is CC.
Yes, but they both seem to get mentioned in the text for CCO3 as well, so I kind of assume they're kind of considered there as well.
Yes, so CCO3 is covering both. So yes, it would be picking up on both. We've then added in obviously the energy storage policy, which picks up on some specific issues for those in CCO4 as well.
Okay, thank you. Now, I realise comments you that made at the start that we don't want this policy document to inflate. It needs to be concise. But I also take on Councillor Young's point earlier that we may, in some cases, need to add some wording to ensure that we focus on the correct things, or it can't be misconstrued. So, under point three under CCO3, can I suggest that we some form of tightening of the words to cover requirements that the plans for removal and restoration of the site shall remain viable, even if by that point the entity submitting the application no longer exists or has insufficient resources to effect such control. I recommend the committee give serious consideration to the comments on this part from Councillor Mo Dodson from Hawkchurch BC, and, for example, something like changing the words to appropriate plans and a mechanism are in place to ensure the removal of the technology on cessation of energy generation / storage and restoration of the site to its original use or an acceptable alternative use, whether due to expiry of the approved site use of the site or the premature end following an incident rendering the site no longer usable for the permitted energy generation / storage purpose. Funding for such plans via a letter of credit, bond or other equivalent instruments will be required to be demonstrated. Now, I know that you might say some of that is probably about conditions that you apply to an application, but I think it's important to at least signpost those in our policies to ensure that applicants are aware this is where we're going, and we don't want to leave those things to chance, because 40 years out, how do we know they're going to restore that site?
What I'd say in response is that any planning permission or any planning obligations run with the land, so it doesn't really matter who actually undertakes the development and then who owns it ultimately at the end when it comes to the end of its usable life. Any enforcement action would be taken against the owner of the land, fundamentally. So I'm confident that we've got enforcement powers anyway. But I think this is also getting into a level of detail that doesn't need to be in the local plan and in these policies. It may be that we need to bring forward supplementary planning guidance documents that supplement this in terms of renewable energy issues such as that and other issues that were raised by the speakers to clarify our position on these things. But I think it's a level of detail that doesn't need to be in the policy. But in any event, I think our enforcement powers, because it runs with the land, are adequate to address the issue.
Yeah, I guess my concern there is that the cost to do that is potentially very significant, and it's unlikely a landowner who owns a field would have the resources to address that. So for the energy storage systems, we're asking them to have some sort of impermeable membrane under all or most of the site to stop firewater escaping into the environment. That's a massive undertaking to take it away, even if things are normal. But in the event of a disaster, that's now a very expensive process, and we want to ensure that we're not taking that risk of leaving that damage for future generations to pick up through the district or whatever, because we won't be able to afford it.
I mean, it's probably worthy of further investigation in terms of what powers we would have in those circumstances and whether or not we need further guidance. I think there's also an element of the landowners when entering into agreements with providers of renewable energy generating and storage schemes, ensuring that they are protecting themselves in terms of if the company goes bust, in terms of who's responsible for removing the infrastructure that's put on their land, because any enforcement powers under the planning legislation is against the landowner. So they are the ones that would be responsible, so they should be taking action to protect themselves.
I'm pausing in case you had anything to follow up with, Duncan.
I've got some more comments on CCO4, but maybe if we want to discuss the rest of CCO3, is that a good point for me to?
I mean, I'd prefer to do outside committee first and then come inside.
Okay,
so if you have comments about other policies.
So CCO4 specifically about energy storage. Councillor Dodson made the very thoughtful comment on behalf of the Hortchurch Parish Council that the location and to what the energy storage is connected makes a big difference to the contribution of such sites to low carbon power supply. And I recommend the committee give that serious consideration. In addition, I also feel that the introduction to this section needs to make the point that the time when energy is made is often separated by a gap of many hours from the time when demand is highest, and thus to provide real benefit to energy storage systems solutions must enable energy to be stored long enough to cover those gaps. So, for example, could something like the following lines be added? Energy storage systems whose design and technology choices will not support storage long enough to cover typical gaps between periods of maximum production and consumption will be considered to provide fewer low-carbon benefits to justify siting in rural, undeveloped locations, and especially in areas of high biodiversity and environmental sensitivity. Is that the sort of thing that we can use, in addition to the comments from Councillor Dodson, to encourage developers to go for energy storage systems that really are a contribution to a low carbon economy, and not just say they are because I'm storing energy?
I'm happy to take away an action to look at that. I think part of the issue, and my understanding is that in terms of a lot of this, is that we end up with these storage facilities adjacent to things like solar farms, because they're obviously, as we're now, generating energy during the day when it's not needed to store it for when it is needed. But there's also issues in terms of capacity in the grid for when that energy is being generated for it to be fed into the grid, which is why they're seeking storage facilities adjacent to it, so that it can come from the energy generating source, the solar farm or wind farm, into the energy storage facility without going into the grid at that point, and then be fed into the grid later on when it's needed. So there are grid capacity issues, I think, to be taken into account in terms of that. I don't think it's as simple to say that you could have a storage facility miles away from the solar farm, because if you haven't got the grid capacity to transfer that energy to there, then you're not going to be able to store that energy and capture it. So I think there are wider functional issues about how all of that works that need to be taken account of, which I don't profess to be any kind of expert for, but I can see the principle of trying to locate those facilities in the least sensitive locations, I think is sound. I think to some extent that also comes into this principle when we're looking at policies in the plan, that you need to read the plan as a whole. So I think that logic also follows through in terms of the other policies in the plan. Excuse me. Which would naturally seek to locate development in the most sustainable locations within towns and settlements rather than in the open countryside. So happy to take away an action to look at that, but I think there's some wider thinking that needs to go into how we address that issue.
Can I make...
Please do.
Make my final point about validation requirements, and that might not be really part of the plan, but maybe we need to signal it. To my mind, to be acceptable, plans, applications to develop must detail impacts on the local environment, including local atmosphere, aquatic environments and underlying aquifer, from both normal operation and from failures resulting in thermal runaway or other possible pollution events. So the plans must describe the technology and site design elements incorporated to eliminate or minimise such impacts in sufficient detail that the risks are known when assessing the application, in order to balance such risks against development objectives and planned contribution to carbon reduction. So the LPA needs to understand risks in order to make an informed decision when we're presented with these applications. For example, are the risks of thermal runaway equally distributed across the possible battery states, discharge, charging, fully charged, discharging? I suspect they're not. And so if they're not, an application which gives guidance on the number of charge-discharge cycles required per day to make the project financially viable would be very relevant. For example, if the highest risk is during charging, does the community face that charging risk once per day or every 4 hours throughout the day? Can we require applications to include this information, or at least state the application will state that applications that do provide that will be graded somewhat more favourably, to encourage basically applications to take these risks very seriously and give us, as the LPA, sufficient evidence, information to make an informed choice as to what risks we're potentially pushing to the local communities.
I mean, I think it's difficult because we're getting into territory that's partly not necessarily planning and more sort of health and safety and other legislation, but also quite specialist areas in terms of consultees, such as the Environment Agency, the National Fire Fire authorities and things. Because I don't profess to be an expert in this. In terms of when you refer to sort of charging cycles and discharge cycles, I don't know how we would ever monitor and enforce that if we did have that information to then say it has to operate in accordance with that. How would our enforcement officer ever know? So I don't think we could control those things. But I question whether or not we need to. I mean, I think the way the policy is written, we're relying on consultees to advise us on these sorts of risks, whether it's the Environment Agency or the Fire Authority, complying the National Fire Chiefs Council's guidance, etc. So I think, again, we're sort of delving into a level of detail that we don't need to concern ourselves with. That's what consultees will be advising us on, and as long as we're complying with their guidance and their requirements, then through the application process, then hopefully we're managing those risks appropriately.
If I could just ask one small question, I mean, can we require pre-screening of these sort of applications by the EA and the Fire and Rescue Service in order that by the time it comes to us in committee, that we've got that evidence? Because it seems that a lot of the applications we've seen so far, there's been a huge back and forth, which takes an awful lot of time, and then we end up with a case of we didn't determine the application soon enough. I want to go to the planning inspector, please. So can we have a policy that pushes that work forwards in the process, that we will encourage applications to come in with that level of detail, and then we can get to deciding on them more rapidly? Thank you.
We can certainly have guidance that encourages them to do pre-application discussions through us and through those consultees, but we can't require them to do that. I think I'm right in saying we've got general guidance out there that encourages people to do pre-application discussions on all major developments anyway. But we can certainly, if we're looking at more detailed guidance on renewables and energy storage facilities, we can certainly make it clear that we expect pre-application discussion and also engagement with affected communities through that process.
Okay, thank you, Duncan, for that thorough examination of that issue. I'm still outside committee, folks, and I have Councillor Faithful.
Following on from that subject, I have brought the subject up before. Pump storage hydroelectricity. It has far less harmful impact, both landscape and environmental impact. We have hills, we've got plenty of places, we've got 500 foot of drop from the top of the hill to the bottom of the valley, and we do get a good dose of water down here. And why can't we be looking more and doing more to support pump storage hydroelectricity as a way of storing our energy off peak? Because, you know, if people want to address environment, this is the place to do it. And we're using all this energy, but we're getting this gas-fired thing down at Hillbarton, and all these other things going on. They're not environmentally friendly. So can we do something in there to encourage this, please?
I think I'd be right in saying that actually for pump storage you need an awful lot more topographical variation than we have here. For a small scale scheme that you know might power a farm or whatever maybe, but if you're talking if we're talking grid scale pumped storage, you need an awful lot more space, you need an awful lot more height. and you're talking tens of millions of pounds per facility to achieve the
I'm
scale.
not talking about, we're on the end of the grid down here. We've got Hinkley Point Power Station supplying most of our energy down this end of the country, but you need to have something at the end of the grid, because when you're right out in the sticks, the people right at the end are the ones who lose out. They get the, things struggling to work because they're right at the end of the cables. And if we've got a network around Tipton Roller Mill, they've diverted the water. They've still got the same mill lead, and he's producing something like 27 kilowatts from about a 10-foot drop. And that's the old mill lead. If you walk past it, there's hardly any water going through it, and yet it's producing quite a lot. If you multiply that all the way up to the top of the hill, 500 feet is quite a substantial difference from 10 feet. So we have got, at least look into the subject, but sitting here at a meeting just playing around and theorising on things that we really don't do that much of, I think is a very naive way of addressing it. Can we properly look at the subject? Thank you, Chair.
We can certainly take an action to have a look at it, Peter. Climate change and renewable energy generation is one of my specialisms from my master's degree. So respectfully, we're not necessarily just sat here theorising. Mr. Freeman.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I don't profess to be any kind of expert, but I know we did do a low carbon study as part of the early work on the plan, which was commissioned by from SWIG, that looked at opportunities for different low carbon energy generating and storage uses within the district. And essentially, I think their study identified very few opportunities for hydroelectric energy generation and storage in the district. There are very few for wind energy as well. The majority is for solar within the district. However, we have purposely drafted strategic policy CCO3 so that it's not excluding any kind of renewable energy generation or storage. It's very much written on the basis of all proposals for low carbon and renewable energy generating and storage schemes within the district will be supported, and then the criteria kick in. So if someone comes forward with a hydroelectric based scheme, we'd be happy to consider it under that policy. So it's not excluded, but our expectation through the work that we've done is that we would see very few, if any, of those schemes coming forward in the district in the planned period.
Thank you, Mr. Freeman. Coming into committee then, I've got to be honest, I have absolutely no idea who put their hand up first 15 minutes ago. So I'm going to start in the back corner and come round. So we'll go Councillor Davey first.
Okay, I have some short comments on most of the policies in here. So my first is page 330, policy CCO2. I'm concerned about pinning all our hopes on the Future Homes Standard. Is it really sufficient? Is relying on building regs enough? What are the specific provisions that are required by the Future Homes Standard? Because some of the commentary on it when it came out was pretty damning. And is it sufficiently rigorous? Because I'm concerned that we may be pinning our hopes on something that just isn't going to deliver for us. That's my first one. My next is the next policy, CCO3, very short one. There's no mention of the grade of farmland. And I do wonder if we should be stating some specific support for lower grade farmland developments rather than using BMV land for renewable energy developments. My next one is on CCO4. I'm just concerned that, again, using the National Fire Chiefs Council guidance, should we insert there something like, or any superseding standard? so that again, we're not hostage to fortune that some other standard comes out that then isn't part of our policy. And finally, on heat networks, it says proposals above 1,200 homes or 10 hectares of commercial floor space, if they're not connecting into an existing heat network, will be required to provide their own network unless it's demonstrated to be technically not achievable or significantly undermines commercial viability. Can we also perhaps insert there something like, or there's a more low carbon alternative that can be provided? Again, I'm concerned that we may be ruling out future technologies that might actually prove to be better than heat networks, about which I have some misgivings. That's the last one. Thank you.
Before you come back to those series of questions, I had one on CCO5 as well. How does the policy relate to proposals that cover multiple allocations within the same area? I'm thinking land north of Topsham, principally, but I'll leave that to you to respond, Mr. Freeman.
Thank you, Chair. So if I go back to CCO2, in terms of the new future home standard, I'm struggling to remember off the top of my head exactly what gets added in as part of the changes in the requirements coming forward in 2025. But I know from discussions with SWIG, it was felt that it takes us most of the way to zero carbon. And which is why they've been advising us that it makes more sense to go with that through building regulations than it does to have our own standard. Their advice was very much about trying to do things in our policy that go beyond the future home standard, which is where sort of point 2 comes in about ensuring that other technologies, particularly solar panels, heat pumps and things, can simply be fitted to and wired into new developments, because they're saying that essentially you could comply with the future home standard and not put solar panels, for example, on the roof by getting your points, because it's a pointed scoring system, getting your points through other things like much higher insulation and other things. But if we're requiring people to comply with the future home standard, so they get to a certain standard through that system, and then we're also requiring them to make it the home easily adapted through the addition of solar panels by having all of the wiring in place, for example, the roof being designed so structurally it can take solar panels, for example, if we're looking at solar orientation through the design of the scheme, so that the schemes are homes are orientated so that they could maximise the solar panels in terms of collection of energy in the future, then we're creating an environment where the home is built to the future home standard, and then occupiers can potentially add on these additional technologies that takes it above and beyond that at relatively low cost compared to what it would otherwise be. And their advice is that that's the best solution, and this relates back to a report I think I brought in February about how we deal with all of this, which members ultimately agreed to go with that solution. What we've tried to do, excuse me, in terms of point 1 within that is obviously it's not certain that the upgraded standards that are due to come in through building regulations next year will come in. So we tried to future-proof this by saying that if the Future Home Standard 2025 is not incorporated into building regulations by the date of local plan adoption, then we'll be applying the draft standards which are required ourselves through the planning process. So that between that point and the other points in that policy, we should be achieving a much higher standard, and the highest standard I think we realistically can through the process and systems that are in place. So that was the thinking behind that. In terms of CCO3, best and most versatile agricultural land, we have a policy elsewhere. Don't think we've come across it yet. I've got a feeling it might be in the biodiversity chapter later on, that is an overarching policy that covers best and most versatile agricultural land and tries to focus development on the least viable agricultural land and retain the highest value. So that is an overarching policy. So we then tried to avoid restating that in every other policy, because that's going to get mind-numbing to read the plan. So the principle is you have to read the plan as a whole, and policies like that come into a number of other areas within the plan. In terms of CCO4, yes, I think that's a fair point. We obviously don't know what future guidance might be coming forward. We've obviously said all schemes will need to comply with up-to-date National Fire Chiefs Council guidance, but we don't know what other guidance other bodies might bring forward. There's a balance there in terms of giving suitable clarity within the policy rather than leaving everything open-ended for future standards. But it might be that someone like the Health and Safety Executive comes in and issues their own guidance in terms of those things. So happy to take away an action to look at how we can redraft the policy to allow for that eventuality. Heat networks, CCO5. Yeah, so I think the point here was about equivalent sort of carbon savings from alternative technologies. I suppose this is a question of strategy. We've kind of been quite committed, I think, to heat networks as an authority in the past with developments at Cranbrook and the Growth Point area, and that was kind of carried forward into this plan in the sense that it's, well, I appreciate there are concerns in some cases in terms of the source of the heat and whether or not that in itself is low carbon. Once you have the network in place, you can feed all sorts of waste heat and other heat sources into that network. So I think the thinking always was that if we're requiring those networks in place, we're future-proofing those homes to those wider low carbon solutions, whatever the heat source might be in the future. But obviously they need a certain number of homes or buildings feeding into that to make that viable. And that's part of the challenge in terms of delivering those. I suppose my fear slightly in terms of going down the route of giving them a get out of alternative technologies is, will we build sufficient capacity and demand within the networks that we've got and future networks to help to make them as viable as they could be and tap into as many different heat sources and as they could potentially. The bigger they are, the more efficient they are, the lower carbon they are. So by giving a get out, we run the risk that developers choose to go down that alternative route because it's potentially less challenging to deliver that than it is through a heat network, and then we lose the cumulative benefits of the bigger networks that could otherwise be achieved. So I guess that's a question back to the committee as to how you want to deal with that. In terms of the Chair's point about multiple allocations, I guess the point is we've put in a threshold of 1,200 homes or more, but if that's cumulative beyond one allocation, I think is the point. We can certainly look at that. I think there's a question in my mind, I suppose, taking north of Topsham, for example, that's obviously going to breach. Our side won't be 1,200, but cumulatively with the Exeter side, it would be. So we perhaps need to think through how we deal with that, because you've also got the motorway in the middle as well. But if some kind of heat network could come forward in that area, that would potentially be beneficial. I think that's probably the only place at which that issue would arise. So I'll take that away and give some thought to how we address that one.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Freeman. A marathon response there. Coming down the line then, I think next up was Councillor Young, if you can still remember your question or point.
Yeah. First of all, CCO4, I think the blurb following it needs to be changed substantially. You've got to remember that battery storage is not only acid batteries or lithium batteries. But as it says in the blurb here, lithium-ion batteries and pumped hydroelectric are the dominant technology. And we're obviously not talking about hydroelectric here. But just to cover the point that Councillor Faithful mentioned about hydroelectric, we haven't got enough drop around here to have hydroelectric. You need dirty great big dams, you need a lot of pipe work, you pump the water from one dam up to another one and then at night release it. Or if you just generating electricity, you need dirty great big dams, large rivers, and we haven't got those sort of rivers around here to be able to do that in a substantial way. Yes, a resident can generate enough possibly for his farm, but we won't be able to generate enough for a large area. The only way you could do it is to dam up, say, the ex-estuary, and have tidal power. That's been looked at all over the place. It doesn't work in France. They've done it, and they've flooded dirty big valleys, and it doesn't work. It doesn't generate enough. So no, hydroelectric dams, and you've got flooding issues. You've got changing the river flows and stuff. No, it just, unfortunately, we haven't got enough drop. Even say from Dartmoor down to the coast, it won't work. But I think we need to look at there is. I don't think the industry on battery storage has actually caught up with the requirements that we have to take. For instance, if you look at petrol stations, there is big issues with fire and with pollution with petrol stations. That's covered with petroleum regulations, which is not within planning. So we need to recognise that there could be potential damage if there's a fire and these chemicals get into the water. But should it be within this plan, or should we be asking government to get on with it and get the regulations right? There's a balance there. We could be tying ourselves up in knots. And also we've got to look at the changing technology. We need to be considering there are clean technologies of battery storage. I understand there is compression of sand is one of the ways, compression of air is another way. There are far more technologies coming through, and we shouldn't be we're only looking at the acid type batteries that are current at the moment. So we need to be having having policies to cover the existing technology, but not restrict ourselves to future technologies.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. I think Mr. Freeman can take those points away, building on what's been said previously. Councillor Brian Bailey.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I'd like to say that I'm pleased that you've incorporated the Fire Chief's Council guidance, because not so long ago when we discussed something regarding these battery storages, we had a lot of discontent among the officers and the councillors about the safety of these things, which has obviously been addressed, which is good news. However, I beg to differ with my learned friend here about France not producing hydroelectricity. It does produce a lot of hydroelectricity. Could we perhaps
not go any further
down
down that particular rabbit hole?
So that's an option. Tidal, we're surrounded by the English Channel, the Bristol Channel. We have the tides in and out all the time. I think that if we were to investigate on a serious note, that we could produce locally enough tidal electricity for Exmouth, Sidmouth and inland towns, if we were to follow it and make sure that it was safe. Because the worst thing that can happen with tidal production is the system fails. There's no storage, there's no explosive risk, there's no fire risk. Whereas this we're talking about now has all those things attached to them. So I think if we were to explore different manners of producing electricity, I think that's the future. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Bailey. I think I'd probably be fair in saying that tidal energy schemes of the scale required to make them commercially viable would be a matter for government rather than for us necessarily. But point taken there, Councillor Bailey, thank you. Coming round then, I think next in my list was Councillor Ingham.
Thank you, Chair. On what you just said, Chair, there was a councillor from Exmouth a good 30 years ago who talked of what about having a pedestrian lift across the estuary. You know, like you have at ski resorts, what do you call it? You know what I mean. And everyone thought he was crackers. Not so crazy now, you know, depending on technology and innovation, isn't it? So I don't think we should laugh too easily at some of the blue sky thinking, you know, that we have. And I certainly subscribe to what Brian was aspiring for us to have, that vision, you know, because we have, forgive me, I'm going to take a gamble here, none of us are smart enough in this room to come up with the innovative technology to give us the answer to some of our concerns today. But there's lots of people out there who are, and we should be ready to embrace that and listen to them. I have to say, I'm sorry, but I do think this chapter is a bit of like a bolt-on, and my gravest concern is some of our opinions, you know, and concerns that we've mentioned today are like an add-on to the bolt-on. And I really think, in my opinion, this should be chapter 1. This is the most important thing we should have started on, to say, how do we want to power East Devon? And then once we've embraced some of those ideas, said, well, how can we make our emerging local plan fit into that? But we are where we are. And so I have to say that Mr. Freeman, as is usual, he's got the emerging local plan checklist, and he's made damn sure this chapter fits, and it will be compliant, I'm sure, at inspection. But there were one or two things that people said I think were quite important regarding this, and that was for all the right reasons. You may want to tighten down strategy 3 and 4, and that's a big temptation. But there is the thing coming back to trying to control what you don't know. Policies are put must be simple to understand and not so rigid that they do not embrace innovation, change and emerging technology, which some of you said, you know, and it's getting that balance, isn't it? It's very difficult. You want to stop the bad things, but you mustn't stop the good things. And we don't know what all of those are. Councillor Davies said something like, he hopes we weren't pinning our hopes on potential failure, you know, and that's why you have to be broad-minded, free-thinking, and embrace all the new opportunities, which will come along in the next 10 years, let alone the next 50 years. And so, you know, we must get this chapter right and not too rigid, and it must be simple, are not too prescriptive. For example, you know, we talk of heat networks. I'd suggest they don't preclude other green energies, but we say, oh, well, we're not going to put them on that town, you know, say on the roofs of dwellings in that town, because we've got a heat network. Why? We've got to really be free thinking and create as much green energy as possible. Otherwise, we're going to have 150-mile-an-hour winds. You know, I don't know when, but instead of once a year, they're going to be more and more frequent. And that's why this chapter is so important in my book, Chair. Thank you.
Just picking up on this kind of question, because it's been raised a couple of times now about policies restricting future technologies coming forward. And I appreciate Councillor Young's pointed out the supporting text underneath CC04 does talk about some specific policies. But I've been having another look through while folks have been speaking, and I'm particularly at CC03 and CC04. I'm not sure I necessarily see any language that says, no, thou shalt not come forward with any new inventions like Ollie's buses in the future. I'm very happy to be corrected if I've missed something, but I don't know, Mr. Freeman, if you wanted to comment on that one.
No, you're right, Chair. I mean, that's very much the intention in terms of the drafting of the policies, particularly CC03 and CC04, was to leave it open because we don't know what technologies are going to come forward. Hopefully new and better and more efficient and more green technologies will come forward, and we've tried to draft the policies to accommodate those. I think the point that I've heard a couple of times is perhaps more to do with the explanatory text, in that all relates to current technologies because we can only write about what we currently know about, and perhaps we need to look at that to make that clear that sort of at the time of drafting these are the technologies, but we are open to considering new technologies and happy to take away an action to do that. But I think the policies themselves have been future-proofed in the way they've been drafted already.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Freeman. Continuing round, although actually I don't remember seeing any further hands on the left-hand side. So are there any other new points about any policies in this chapter, or can we move on to the next one? Okay, in which case then I'll propose from the Chair that we endorse the proposed revised draft Chapter 7A, subject to the comments set out in discussion. All those in favour, please. That's unanimous. Okay, thank you very much. Chapter 7B, Climate Resilience. Mr. Freeman.
Thank you, Chair. So this is the sort of other half of Chapter 7, which will be a different name chapter ultimately. So this is about adaptation and resilience to climate change, so addressing issues around flood risk and coastal change. So there's been some rewording of flooding policy to take account of the strategic flood risk assessment work that's been going on. We've included a policy now on water efficiency requirements for new dwellings to achieve the higher building regulation standards, which, if I recall, can be enforced through building regulations, but require a planning policy to implement them because they're an optional standard. And the other main thing is about coastal change. I think the policy is largely unchanged, but you'll see in the reports that they, in order to keep the coastal change management area boundaries up to date, there's been some further work on Sidmouth and some changes to the boundaries there in relation to emerging work there. So those are the main changes in terms of this chapter. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Freeman. Any comments from outside committee? No? Okay, I'm going to start us off on this one then. One of the problems that we know will come about with climate change is increasing frequency and intensity of extreme heat events. And I'm not sure I see anything in here that talks about how new developments ought to respond to that risk. Generally in this country, our homes are pretty terrible at doing that because they're designed to keep heat in rather than just prevent temperature fluctuation. Are we missing an opportunity in this chapter not including some policy on that?
So if you go back to strategic policy CCO2 in the previous chapter, and all new homes, one of the requirements is that they be designed to avoid temperature discomfort as a result of rising temperatures. So we haven't been prescriptive. So we haven't been prescriptive about how that might happen, but obviously developers will need to demonstrate through the detailed design that they've designed around those issues, so that we're both retaining heat when we want to retain heat, but it can also be dissipated when there are extreme heat events to avoid discomfort.
Thank you, Mr. Freeman. I'd missed that line. A hangover perhaps when it was one chapter rather than two. I'll go with that. Okay, Councillor Young.
Yeah, that was the point you just made, is something that I've been aware of recently. There's a small housing estate that I know of that built to beautiful, wonderful building standards, and they've all now applied for air conditioning because it gets too hot in the summer. So we've got to bear in mind that if we're building to building standards, it does keep the heat in the summer, and I know a lot of people are moaning that their houses are too hot in the summer now, and they can't. No, just opening the windows doesn't help. So there's that. The other issue is I'm glad to see that we've changed the line at Sidmouth along the front of East Cliffs. We are still working on the beach management plan there. It might be that once we've put the super groin in, or we might have a breakwater in front of those cliffs, erosion will be even less. But I presume that we could pick that up outside the local plan and provide that information to the people that own properties above the cliff. We don't have to preempt what the engineering is going to do on these cliffs, do we?
I don't think we can preempt that. I mean, we can make sure that the plan, when it's submitted, has the most up-to-date boundaries within it, and obviously there'll be opportunities potentially through the examination process to update them further as the work progresses. But once the plan's adopted, those will be the boundaries fundamentally for the plan period. But I mean, ultimately, when you look at the policy in relation to coastal change management areas, the policy is about the types of developments that can take place in those areas, and policies around potentially relocating homes and buildings that are at risk. So I'm not sure that the exact positioning of those lines actually makes a massive amount of difference to how the policy would actually work in reality. But we obviously need to make sure that we keep track of the emerging work and make sure we have the most up-to-date boundaries in the plan when it's adopted.
Presumably, in the event that the evidence changed post-adoption, any applications would be assessed based on that updated evidence if it were to come forward after the local plan was completed.
Well, we could have regard to it, but we'd be departing from the plan at that point. But that would be where more up-to-date information, consideration of other material considerations, etc. So it's not that we would ignore it, but we can't amend them after the plan's been adopted.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Davey.
Just one comment on this chapter. Policy AR03 on page 416. There's a line that says it's about relocation or replacement. Commercial and community uses will be permitted, providing they require a coastal location and provide economic and social benefits to the local community. I wonder if that should be and or, because otherwise we're writing a policy that requires both criteria to be fulfilled. And really, it could just be social benefits. It could be relocation of a village hall or something like that. So I feel as though that should be and/or.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I think that's a good point. Good spot. I'll take that away. I can't see any reason why. Well, I think it makes sense for it to say and/or, as you say, might not just be economic, could be social, one or the other. So yeah, I'll take that away.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Davey. Councillor Howe.
Thank you very much, Chair. And picking up on the point you were raising earlier, and Councillor Young as well, and I don't know where we fit in with all this, but nevertheless, heat has been mentioned, and I wish to refer ourselves to the tree strategy currently in progress, where trees in street scenes radically reduces the heat of buildings and everything else. So it's not just an environmental impact consideration, it is this as well. And I'm sitting here going, how many policies? We don't make reference to a tree strategy. It's not there yet. It needs to be. But we need to link things together, not break them apart all the time. And I'm sat here reading this and going, yeah, actually, heat of buildings is a material consideration. You put trees in the street, the heat decreases by 10 degrees up to, is the evidence, I think even 15 in some cases. That's a hell of a heat difference. And it's cheap, efficient, and simple. And guess what? It's carbon capture as well. So I apologize if I missed it, Mr. Freeman, but me and the chair have been reading these things a fair bit recently, and it's getting a bit tiring, if you get my meaning. And I know you've been reading them the same, but it's just a question. I don't know where it should fit, but it should be there somewhere.
Mr. Freeman, I think the tree strategy is in chapter 9, which is up next, isn't it? If that was
as I say.
I'm sure there is reference to it in chapter 9, whether it's specifically in that context, I'm not sure. I think the way we've worded the policy I referred to in the previous chapter, we've deliberately been quite open about how those issues are addressed in terms of heat discomfort, because you're right, the use of street trees could help to provide shading in the summer. Equally, orientation of dwellings needs to be looked at in terms of, you know, everybody perhaps craves a south-facing garden, but perhaps with the changing climate, that's perhaps not as attractive as it used to be, and you perhaps want south to be on an elevation where you haven't got so many windows and openings to reduce discomfort. So there are lots of ways of designing out those sorts of issues. I don't think necessarily want to be overly prescriptive. The policy I referred to in the previous chapter sort of requires them to have regard to those issues, and I would suggest when we look at design guides and things like that, it would be where we'd perhaps set out guidance around details around orientation of dwellings, use of street trees, and things like that, and how those issues are addressed in detail. The main thing is to have that principle established in the policy, I think, at this stage.
I'm perhaps nitpicking a little bit, but CCO2 does talk about all new homes being required to be designed to avoid temperature discomfort, not proposals at large. So things like street trees that Mike's picked up on wouldn't necessarily be caught. In fact, I don't think they would be caught by that, would they? So is there just some...
Well, you could address the issue of temperature discomfort in new homes by providing street trees in front of those homes that helps to provide shading. So I think it is one way of addressing that issue, but happy to take away an action to look at how we're looking at street trees and how those are addressed. I mean, I would stress there are some challenges in that I don't think Devon County Council would currently accept trees within their streets under their policies. So that is a challenge in terms of how that would be achieved. We have negotiated street trees on the main local route through Cranbrook, for example, but I don't believe that that's something they would necessarily agree with today. So there are some challenges there, I should say, in terms of things like that, that would need to be worked through because of obviously the cost and maintenance issues and potential future risks of tree roots then raising pavements and tarmac and things. There can be lots of challenges with that. So I think under the county's current system, that's an additional cost burden that can be achieved, but they put additional costs onto the developer in terms of that can be quite significant. So that can be a deterrent, or that's not the right word, disincentive to incorporating street trees.
Thank you very much, Devon County Councillor. Are there any new points about policy specifically, just so that we don't go around in circles on the street tree point? We do indeed have the nice tree greeny chapter coming up next. So are there any more points about this one specifically, about the policies in this chapter specifically? Are they? Hands are going up and down, and I really have no idea. Councillor Ingham, do you have a point about policy in this chapter?
Yes.
Please go ahead.
A concern and an invitation to Mr. Freeman, if he hasn't got enough work on his plate anyway, is on this chapter. I am concerned that we don't overcook the egg and put ourselves in a position in the future where people may say, oh, it's East Devon District Council responsibility to put that right. Let's have a look back in this chapter, and the implication is that we will address these problems. Obviously, we will address what we can and what we can afford to do. And I just invite Mr. Freeman to double check that no one will be quoting this chapter back at us and say, you know, after a climate change event, you know, of some magnitude, that we're seen as the body responsible for putting it right, because there's no way we can do that. And we don't want to be liable based on our own policies for correcting everything that happens in East Devon. Do you see what I'm saying? Just to make sure we don't make ourselves appear liable in the event of certain climate change events. Is that clear? Yep.
I understand the point, certainly. I'm not sure where it would crop up, but Mr. Freeman can take that away and ponder. Coming round then, Councillor Davey, policy point.
I was just going to make a quick point about CCO2. It could just say homes and developments having resilience to extreme heat. And that would kind of hopefully solve the problem.
I think Mr. Freeman has written the point down, and we'll take it away to consider, haven't you? Yes, it says street trees, exclamation mark. So that will be covered. Anything new then about this chapter, or can we move on to the last one? Okay, in which case then I'll propose from the chair, I've lost the wording, that we endorse the proposed draft revised chapter 7B for the Regulation 19 version of the local plan. All those in favour, please. It's subject to the comments, the usual. Okay. Yes, it was, yes. Okay, do we want a short break before we do this chapter, or should we plough on through? Okay, crack on. Okay then, we come to chapter, it says 13 on this thing and 9 on the other thing. The biodiversity chapter, Mr. Freeman. No, Yehudi's gone.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So chapter 13, based on the current numbering anyway, protecting and enhancing our outstanding biodiversity and geodiversity. We basically tried to sort of edit this chapter a bit and rationalise it. So you'll see some policies have been split, some have been amalgamated, some have been removed where not necessary because it's repetition, or again adding unnecessary to national guidance and practice. I think the main sort of headline, I suppose, within this has always been our aspiration for 20% biodiversity net gain rather than the 10% that the legislation actually requires. This has been sort of defined as for major developments, so housing developments where 10 or more homes will be provided, or the site has an area of more than half a hectare, or for non-residential development, additional floor space of 1,000 square metres or more. So what we're proposing is we require 20% from major developments, 10% from the more minor developments. So this takes account of the challenges of trying to deliver biodiversity net gain on site and not discourage things like urban infill and things like that to wider goals of the plan. So we're not snookering ourselves by unrealistic requirements there. So yeah, that's the biodiversity and geodiversity chapter. I must think of a catchier title, I think. Thank you, Chair.
Biogeodiversity? Maybe. Outside committee, any comments? No. Inside committee, comments? Councillor Howe.
I don't know about comment, but it's definitely a question. Policy PB02, first paragraph is development proposals that would cause a direct or indirect adverse effect in regionally and locally important wildlife sites will not be supported. What about unconfirmed wildlife sites and other such things? Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's the trouble. Yeah, okay. I know it's such sites include, but it just seems contrary to the actual wording of the policy. But
As I've just pointed out to Councillor
It's
Howe,
further down on the
the such sites include unconfirmed wildlife sites. Further down on the list. Mr. Freeman saw you coming.
I don't mind that.
I suppose the question is whether members are happy with the kind of construction of those policies, because I think it's a theme through a couple of policies where there's then the policy and then there's a list of the sites that are included at the end. I actually think, to my mind, that's a bit clearer than actually putting a long list at the start of the policy that loses people's attention. It's almost clearer having them at the end, but that is something that's different in these policies, perhaps to others you'll have seen.
I tend to agree with you, Mr. Freeman. Councillor Young.
Unconfirmed important areas of nature, or whatever it was. How can we define that? Now, does someone come along and say, I found a rare bird in this field here, so therefore it should be? Or is there a definition that we can attach to this plan so people don't start saying, oh, I've got one of these areas at the back of my garden?
It's essentially a designation of its own, strangely, unconfirmed wildlife sites. They're actually all recorded on our system, so we know where they are. However unconfirmed they may be. So they're confirmed as unconfirmed. That's the way I look at it. So yeah, I mean, ultimately that they should become county wildlife sites, but they're just currently in that process. I suppose it's almost like a provisional tree preservation order or something like that. It's in train in that sense. So hopefully that sort of precludes people coming forward and saying they've got an unconfirmed wildlife site in their garden, but equally, we get a lot of information in response to planning applications of people commenting that they've seen particular wildlife or protected species in a locality, and obviously we have to look into that and look at what evidence there is to support that through the application process.
Yeah, I just wonder if we could have a note to explain that, so people are clear as defined on map so-and-so or something like that. But also, the boundaries for these specific sites are obviously changing all the time. National Nature Reserves has changed substantially in this area over the last couple of years, and there's plans to expand it even more. So it's now at the time when a planning application comes in, it's that boundary then. It's not the boundary set in stone at the start of this plan.
That's right. Thank you, Councillor Young. Councillor Ingham.
Your favourite subject, trees. I thought, can I speak on trees? A couple of things. Give you some examples. Because of the decisions we've taken in the last couple of months, some landowners, developers have hacked down a few trees, certainly in my ward, and ironically, they're on site allegations that we moved on from that weren't allocated. So it's such a shame when that happens. Last week I noticed an ex-tree warden in my ward had cut down some trees, on the edge of his land, and you think, why? This is just so wrong. At this time, we need to keep as many trees as possible. Is there anything other than TPOs? No, potentially we can do that, but we got to justify a TPO, haven't we? And that has, black lines that we have to cross or not cross to justify that. What can we do to beef up, that we got that lovely sentence, bottom of 481, to make that more weighty? What can we actually do to prevent so many of the just ordinary trees within East Devon getting hacked down on the off chance it may get in the way of a planning application? Is it only through TPOs that we can do that? What else can we do to stop trees being cut down on a whim, basically?
The only way to protect trees is really through tree preservation orders, and that's trees of high amenity value and biodiversity value and things. So there's a test. You can't just protect any old tree through a tree preservation order. What I would say, and I think one thing that will be to our advantage moving forward, is the biodiversity net gain requirements mean that it's disadvantage. Is it putting yourself to disadvantage if you remove habitat before you make a planning application, because your biodiversity net gain requirements are then you've got to make that back up again. So the hope is that through biodiversity net gain that will help to act as a measure to prevent developers going in and removing all of the habitat before they make a planning application. It wouldn't make any sense the way the biodiversity net gain metric actually works, because it would take account of that and you'd have to go back to a position before you remove that. So that helps, I think.
That's the bulk of it, Chair, isn't it? And we are dealing, sorry to cut across you, but you're absolutely right. We're dealing with that well, I think, or doing our best. Is there anything else outside of that we can do? But it sounds as though it's just TPOs and that's it, and get smarter on them. Is that it?
Basically, yes. And I think that the trees team are reviewing tree preservation orders and looking at opportunities to increase our use of tree preservation orders. I guess the other thing is sort of raising awareness of the importance of trees and getting advice out there so that people aren't unnecessarily removing trees, because it's causing issues for them in their garden or something with leaf drop and things, that they investigate all alternatives and other ways, or at least that, if they do have to remove a tree, they're replacing them with a more suitable species for that locality and getting advice on how to do that.
A second item, Chair, backing up Councillor Howe's concerns, trees and roads. As a lad, I grew up in another country where they had roads maybe as wide as this hall, and rows of trees about as far as the length of this hall, and they were planted maybe 200, 250 years ago, and they used to meet above, and you'd be travelling big distances, really hot temperatures, and it was wonderful. You could get out your car and you still feel good. And I have to say, this particular country, which has expanded rapidly the last 20, 30 years, they've cut down a lot of those trees to put in dual carriageways, and guess what? They're absolute hell to drive on. You travel on them very fast, but there's not only that, but there were like hundreds, thousands of trees planted to do that. And that's what, you know, in our own little way in East Devon, I'm sure we can, that's the kind of thing I don't mind us being responsible for, because we can, over a period of time, afford to do that. But some of the other things with regard to climate change, I really think we ought to be very careful about saying, oh, we can sort that out.
Thank you, Councillor Ingham. Councillor Young.
Yeah, the tree policy that we're working on at the moment, nearly done, we have identified the trees that are cut down prior to development. It is tricky how do you identify something that that we don't know about yet. But the biodiversity net gain will prevent that, hopefully, in some ways, but that's going to take some time to kick in. Streamlining the TPO paperwork and systems would be really helpful. Yeah, but that would have to come from government. And regarding trees and avenues on built-up areas, yes, highways are dead against it because it damages the pavements and the roads, and also the cables and pipes that are underneath the road. So there's an issue there, but there are ways of preventing that. Westminster Council have planted, I think, about 20,000 trees on their streets, and they put them in sort of tubes that will prevent the majority of that. It doesn't prevent everything, but lessons are being learned, and I think it's not something for a local plan, but it's stuff that we can work on in the next couple of years.
Mr. Freeman has just pointed out to me that at the end of policy PB08, or close to the end, the third to last paragraph actually has a policy to ensure that any new streets are tree lined. So it turns out it is in there. But yes, there's the issue with Devon Highways, and I'm feeling a letter coming on, but we'll see how we can pick that up elsewhere. Any other comments about this chapter? No? Okay, in which case then I will propose from the chair the wording that I keep losing, that committee endorse the proposed draft revised chapter 9, subject to chapter 13, appendix 9, subject to the comments set out. All those in favour, please. Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much, members. That brings us to the end of our meeting today. And for once, I can't say I will see you next week. Thank you very much, members.